Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to the 2000 AD Thrillcast. I am your host, Malt Shah. This time we are talking all things Devlin Waugh. A very large splash began in magazine 415 and we'll be continuing for 5 episodes. And fantastic to welcome Aleš Kot, who is the writer on this new series with art by the inimitable Mike Dowling. It's fantastic to be able to talk to Aleš, who's a relatively new writer for 2000 AD. He did the Devlin story back in magazine 400, and that went down very well, so we decided to have him back to further explore his vision for the gay vampire exorcist and the crazy world created by Sean Phillips and, of course, John Smith. So we're going to be chatting to him in a moment. Don't forget the 2000 AD Prog 2170 is out this week, and this is our all ages issue. We talked about it on the last episode. Fantastic lineup of creators. It truly is an issue that is for all ages. Don't be fooled by people who say that all ages is for kids. If you're into your 2000 AD, if you're looking for a jumping on point, something to get back into the swing of reading 2000 AD, then this is perfect. They're all standalone stories, so you can grab that and then go straight into reading the prog. Next week, all the regular stories continue, and it's been a fantastic lineup. Some really great feedback over the last few months about what a high 2000 AD is on. Even if I say so myself, I know I'm paid to say that, but you know. It's also true. So we're going to talk to Aleš about his work with Mike Dowling on Devlin Waugh, A Very Large Splash. So last time on the Thrillcast, we were worried that we were cursed. This time on the Thrillcast, I think we're most definitely haunted by the spirit of a demon trapped in a sex toy, courtesy of Aleš Kot, who joins us on the line all the way from LA. Hi, Aleš, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty great. I woke up at about 6 a.m. here in LA. It's about 9:20 right now, where I spend some time writing. I like starting my week early whenever I can, and I completely forgot myself this weekend and ended up reading an entire book from Saturday to Sunday night, so I kind of caught up on my sleep, and I feel so fresh and so ready to have this beautiful conversation with you. Oh.
That sounds like such a luxury.
It truly was.
So, this kind of... A lot of our readers won't necessarily be au fait with your previous work, but tell us a little bit about yourself, because you're Czech-born, but you're now in LA. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to be writing comics.
Oh yeah, happily. Well, I was born in 1986, shortly after Chernobyl exploded, and my parents were really worried that I'd be a mutant. And I guess, turned out to be a little bit of one, in that I was always really weird, spending a lot of time by myself, hiding away, reading a lot. I started reading really early. I was like 3 when I started reading books by myself a lot, and because my parents taught me very early. And I just kind of like disappearing into the world. And also I was sick a lot, so it was sort of the one way of, just kind of staying in touch with the world. And it was comics and books. And I remember this one time, now retroactively, I kind of feel like that must have been one of those key moments when I was very, very sick with pneumonia, and my mom brought me some early translations of some comic books. Shortly after the Iron Curtain fell in Czechoslovakia at the time, and I just remember kind of vanishing into them, and that I think was huge. And then, comics were always sort of around, more or less. I was always interested. I was always interested in most of pop culture and arts. And never really thought about it much as a job. But then eventually, somewhere along the way, I think I was like 20 or 21 when I just did like 4 hits of acid one night, and then I woke up next morning and was like, all right, I guess I'm going to be making comic books now. And then I decided to make comic books. And then I met a girl in Paris and ended up getting married and moving to LA. And somehow all of those things kind of eventually connected. And for about 4 years later, I published my first graphic novel with Image Comics, and that was called Wild Children, and it did shockingly well. And I quit my job shortly after, so it doing shockingly well was really useful because I had no money, and then it just kind of spun from there.
That's really interesting that you describe an experience which I think an awful lot of not just creators but also readers have had, where you get your first hit of comic books, and as you say, you disappear into them. You're kind of absorbed by them, and they absorb you. What were the kind of things that really fired your imagination back then?
Oh, back then, honestly, it was just whatever I could get my hands on, because the thing is, in Czechoslovakia, when it was like 3 or 4, that would be 1989, 1990. Almost nothing really was getting through in terms of translations. I was a little bit luckier than most kids because one of my grandparents was a truck driver, so he would occasionally sneak in magazines from West Germany. So I would see a little bit more than other kids once in a while, but even then it was just, it was minimal access to anything Western and more like things that felt like they wouldn't necessarily be that problematic under a totalitarian regime. And or then very quickly in, very early 90s, the first translations of stuff, which would be anything from like Conan and Spider-Man to, Donald Duck and, being 4, 5, 6, that was the sort of stuff that I kind of got my hands on and just kind of went from there. But at the same time, I think I also saw like Clive Barker's Hellraiser when I was like 6 or 7. So I would say that there's been a wild overlap of very strange and very weird things in my life in general. And I think that's somewhat made my brain not really care much about staying within any basic constraints of genre just because it's supposed to be good that way, and rather kind of being interested in whatever is the most emotionally affecting thing I can experience or the most transformative experience I can get from art. Yeah, I would say that was kind of a theme that emerged early on.
A lot of your work is marked by either kind of mind expanding stuff, psychedelia, philosophy emerging. Do you think that perhaps the fact that you were picking up bits and pieces of pop culture, you're switching from one thing to the other, so you got the extreme of something like Disney all the way through to something like to Hellraiser, that this embedded itself in the way that you write, the way that you want to tell stories, that you're not afraid to draw on different ideas, move things along at a sort of a left or a right angle, and have that kind of mind-bending way of telling stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? But because when you say like, Disney, from Disney to Hellraiser, I kind of went, oh yeah, I mean, I'm literally writing a story that has an element of a magical demon talking dildo in Devlin, So I'm like, oh wait, I think I see the overlap there, and yeah, it's tricky because on one hand, you can, I think, and I've certainly done that, you can kind of fall into a trap of sort of being eclectic just because you kind of decided that's a thing you can do. And so you just kind of stick with it and do whatever the fuck you want, which can sometimes, present itself in the completely correct way. But other times, I very much dislike the phrase, weird for the sake of weird, because it's usually a phrase that people use in order to say, I don't understand this, and because of that, it's bad. And that's not what I believe in. But I do believe in listening to each story and kind of finding the actual truth, the core of that story, and then kind of finding the way of telling it from there, which sometimes really lends itself to this sort of approach, whether it's Devlin or whether it's Secret Avengers with Marvel, which was another fairly irreverent, funny but also horrifying story about the American warfare prison industrial complex, but also had some really hilarious moments, if I may say so myself, as my best reviewer. But then sometimes there's something else. Sometimes there's, a story like Days of Hate, which I did with Daniel Jejeho in the past couple of years at Image, which is a story about, America a few years from now if the Nazis continue to be in power, and, and about Brexit and about everything else and about all these shit things getting even shittier. So, it all depends. It all depends on the story. I kind of feel that the more I put my ego aside and use whatever tools are right for the particular story at hand, the better the story gets.
One thing, and it's interesting, you used the word irreverent a minute ago. One of the things that really marked your work is a sense of irreverence, of mocking authority. I'm curious as to whether you think that is a byproduct of having grown up at the very tail end of a totalitarian regime, with the world events that were happening at the time, and whether that is something that is imbued sort of subconsciously, that that's how you deal with things that are scary, things that are dangerous, things that are threatening. You take the piss out of them.
Well, I didn't mean for this to sound like a pun, but totally. There's definitely a big crucial influence of me being a young kid and seeing this transition between regimes and complete change and dissolution and just rapid change in terms of borders, in terms of beliefs, in terms of people's whole conduct, in terms of societal conduct. It taught me a lot about identity, and it taught me a lot about identity on every level, from a single human being to large societies. And it also taught me a lot about power in the same way. And I do think that those things should be navigated with, both seriousness and irreverence and humor, and they should be navigated with the wholeness of our human being, of our whole being, instead of just a sort of skimmed on the surface of. Because I think that if we understand power and identity, and if we work on understanding it, we can actually understand ourselves much better. And if we understand ourselves much better, we're far more likely to do good in the world. And so, yes, the answer to that would be a very, very resolute yes. I mean, there's a project that I've written fairly recently, actually the last project I did at Image, called The New World with Trad Moore, where we very much dove into that and dove into, what would happen in the U.S. after the Second Civil War, and if there would be a big wall with Mexico. The thing is, I wrote that project and I started writing that project in 2015. So it was really strange to see it then drop into a world where these things are suddenly feeling much more real in certain ways. And as I was sort of working through it, I started realizing that there were so very specific memories of my own experiences as a child that I was starting to put into this comic, because the situation really is very universal. And so, yeah, that's my answer.
Okay. You've got a form with the kind of genre that Devlin Waugh exists in, because you published Wolf back in 2015. which was crime noir horror fantasy set in LA. It was specifically about a paranormal investigator who is around at the time of the impending apocalypse. What was it that drew you to Devlin as a character? Because we talked on Twitter. You broadcast the fact that it was a character that you really wanted to write, and conversations happened, and here we are. But what was it about the character that really appealed to you?
Well, I needed more money for wine. I just wanted to give an answer that that Devlin would give. But no. Honestly, I always loved Devlin. That's the other funny thing. There were reprints of a lot of 2000 AD stuff, but they were very specifically picked for this Czech magazine, this Czech comics magazine that started coming out in the mid-90s. And, that was my first experience of 2000 AD, and it was by, suddenly seeing Simon Bisley drawn comics and seeing, Devlin Waugh swimming in blood and, Sean Phillips art and reading John Smith and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so my mind was, and everything else from, Judge Dredd to Johnny Nemo to et cetera, early Future Shocks by Alan Moore. And so my mind was kind of blown, and I really loved Devlin for a lot of different reasons. I loved that it was a story that was very clearly willing to mess with a traditional storytelling in comics. I really loved the non-traditional aspects of the narrative as they were written. There was the slight Borosian tinge to the atmosphere of it. At the same time, I really loved the main character. I loved that he's unapologetically queer. I loved that he's very Oscar Wildean in his manner. I really loved that he's kind of an arrogant douche in a lot of ways. All of those things combined, and then also just being hyper professional at the same time. It's kind of like you can't but admire this person because they're clearly very good at their job, but you also like them even more because they know that their job is not the entirety of their being. And Devlin is somebody who is definitely not going to make their job take away their enjoyment of life. And I kind of love these two modes that he blends because they are so deeply indulgent. It's a deeply indulgent character, right? Mm. And you get that. And by the way, that's a beautiful counterbalance to Dredd, too. And, to a lot of the 2000 AD setting that Devlin's within. So there was that. And then also the fact that he's a vampire bodybuilder, ex-Vatican priest. Like it's like you practically, if you come and you make this character up, I feel like most of the time now people would tell you, well, can you pick two of those four things? I'm like, no, that's the point. He is all of those things at once. It should never work. It's a terrible idea. I love it. That's kind of how I feel about Devlin.
You pick up on something there, which is the kind of, and it's something you see in a lot of characters that just seem effortlessly charming. Is the kind of extreme charm of competence, of certainty, of characters who really know what they're doing and have an almost kind of relaxed attitude to the fact they know all this stuff and can do all this stuff. So even in the face of extreme danger, they're incredibly flippant. That moment when Devlin emerges into Alcatraz in Swimming in Blood, and he's just, it's like a Klimt painting, he's effortlessly cool in this most extreme and dangerous circumstance. He's such a contrast to everything around him. And I mean, you're right. It's such just John Smith just created such a charming and I guess the word I'm looking for is attractive character. He's got all these characteristics that make him appealing.
100%.
So in terms of when you came to the character, I guess what I'm interested in is how you because John Smith has such a unique voice in comics. He is a unique voice. There's nobody really quite like John. How do you plug into one of his signature characters without necessarily doing a pastiche of that character? How did you sift through the essence of Devlin?
Well, I actually think that John and I quite clearly have a lot of similar influences. Like I don't think that those influences came to me necessarily through Devlin. I just think that they're sort of there. I would say that I'm not sure if there's people beyond like me and John and Pete Milligan, maybe Grant Morrison, who would kind of like have this specific reference framework in their heads without necessarily needing to, look at what's been done with Devlin and go, well, gee, I should read up on some of these things so I feel like I can sort of like zone into this specific character and this specific mode, right? And then you have this whole other part where you have to be like, and how do I also make it mine at the same time? And, sometimes that's exactly how something that's work for hire goes. There's a project right now where I feel like that's something where I've like had to go over and over trying to find that common ground with people. On Devlin, it's just not like that. On Devlin, it was very much like, no, I want to write Devlin. I know exactly how I want to write Devlin. How about this? And I pitched something to Matt Smith, and Matt was like, I love this. Wow, how about you write this short story and we see? So I wrote the short story. The short story was a beautiful and perfect, except for I think like one or two edits, which were really great. And that was that. The voice came incredibly naturally. It really wasn't. It was just about enjoying it. It was just about leaning into it. And the whole process of leaning into it was really down to me rereading a couple older Devlin comics and remembering what I really love about the character and why I wanted to write the character, which was just down to I want to have fun with Devlin Waugh.
I mean, I guess that answers my next question, which was going to be, what's the first step in writing a Devlin Waugh story? Where does one begin in that process?
Yeah, it was honestly that simple. It was just. I don't even remember how the story really came to be. It just kind of suddenly dropped. It was kind of like that. There was really no larger process. I was thinking about the only part that I really wanted to make sure I had right was just figuring out how to make it socially relevant in some way that wouldn't feel preachy, and that was very easy. And the only other part was figuring out the right demon. And again, that was also incredibly easy. I think I was going through a list of demons and I was like, well, there's a demon of bad grammar. That just sounds perfect. That's like, I can have fun with that in any sort of context. So why don't I throw that against Devlin and just see what happens, right? And what happened is I clearly created a beautiful, enduring character that's now forever stuck inside a gigantic dildo.
Well, let's talk about Titivillus, because the reaction whenever we put an image of Devlin with Titty, as Devlin calls him online, the response is always extreme in both directions. People either love it or they react negatively towards it. Was that intention when you realised this was the best journey for a demon, was to trap it into a sex toy? Did you have a little chuckle to yourself? Was there a sense of, can I do this?
Was there a sense of, can I do this? No, not really. I mean, sexuality is just, to me, is such a normal part of human life that it was, I mean, I definitely had a good chuckle about it because I was just like, this is so, like, now that I came up with it, it's so obvious and it's really funny to me. And I love the idea of a demon being trapped in a gigantic dick. So from that position, I was just kind of like, this is great. I can have fun with this for a long time, which is probably what Devlin said too. And then it just kind of went from there. And I didn't really think about other people in that regard at all. I mean, I think that if I was writing something in the US and I would do that, I'm not even sure if then I would really, like, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't change it, but I would maybe wonder more about the response, because I think that the US is extremely puritanical in certain regards, and at the same time also kind of like oddly not. It's such a weird blend that really goes back, centuries here. But I don't know. I didn't think much of it. I just went, I hope that people are going to be laughing too, but since I'm having a blast writing it, hopefully they will feel the same way. And, thankfully it seems like they do. And as far as people who are reacting negatively, I mean, look, if somebody wants to get upset over a dildo on the internet, they have bigger problems in life than a dildo on the internet.
I want to talk just a little bit about this kind of notion of and to borrow a rubbish term from kind of Silicon Valley, the idea of the disruptor, somebody coming in and disrupting things, shaking things up, and this kind of the reaction to Titty-Villus. Mm-hmm. For me, plugs into Devlin as a character and the way that he talks and the way that he acts. And again, I'll come back to Did you
say the dildo plugs into? I'm sorry. It's just go on.
I was going to leave that one right there for people to make their own minds up. But anyway, going back to kind of swimming in blood, drowning in numbers, swimming in blood. I've got my Greenaway and my Smith mixed up. But where you've got Devlin coming in and breaking the kind of what you would think would be the natural flow of the story, that people are trapped in this prison and then they escape and blah, 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 and there's a happy ending. And it really feels like in A Very Large Splash, Devlin is being a disruptor in his own story, in his own circumstances. So, he for all of the kind of murder mystery aspects that you've got going on, Devlin is there and he's not allowing the narrative to flow as others wish it to flow. And I just want to get your feeling on the notion of Devlin in terms of character, in terms of comedy, as a disruptor, as somebody who is shaking up a story.
Oh, I love that. It's something that sort of, I don't want to spoil too much, but I would say that in some ways, maybe Devlin is his worst own enemy. And this in some way goes back to the consequences of his earlier stories that we sort of uncover as we go along here. But it also kind of goes, to show that sometimes that's exactly what you need to make a party really good. And the trick is finding the balance between the two. And Devlin kind of maybe seems like there's a little bit of a loss of balance for him in that regard. Like, you can definitely, I think, in certain stories especially, kind of track Devlin as somebody who, is a tad selfish beyond something that is necessarily healthy. And other times, that selfishness is precisely the thing that makes him so fun and so exciting and so refreshing. And I kind of wanted to hit on that. And that was sort of something that was a part of what I voiced in the pitch or the outline as one of the key elements of the story. And, together with that, there's this element of friendship. And becoming friends with, a demon trapped in a dildo, and kind of going, hey, is this real? is this a friendship we're having, or is this something where because you're a demon, you're sooner or later going to do something terrible? Or am I going to do something terrible because I know you're a demon and therefore you are likely to do something terrible, right? And that's never a good place for you to be in when it comes to your head, you know? I mean, whether we're talking about a friend who's a demon or a friend who is not a demon, I would generally advise against it. And so that's where Devlin's sort of at, and that kind of headspace to me was interesting because Devlin can be somebody who you can kind of plug him into the story, and the story can be almost very stationary. It can be sort of like, oh well, Devlin is who he is, and we throw everything at Devlin, and we just have fun with seeing Devlin deal with things and never really changing. And I wanted to see what starts happening when you say, well, we can keep all that, but then on top of that, we can also see Devlin go through some sort of a deeper process. And that's where we're sort of what we're going for.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the friendship between Titivillus and Devlin, because it's something I wanted to touch on. Because I was talking to Kevin Scott in the last episode of the Philcast about Rogue Trooper and how Rogue kind of needs the biochips in order to be essentially the other voice, the narrative, the one they bounce off, the one that kind of through conversation you discover their inner voice, because they don't necessarily have an inner voice that they broadcast. Is that the role that Titivillus is fulfilling in A Very Large Splash? That he's to a certain extent acting ironically as a bit of a conscience, as a bit of a kind of Greek chorus there to kind of pull Devlin back necessarily, but also to get him to explain his thoughts and motivations?
Well, I never really thought about it that way because I always thought of Titivillus as and it's not, not that I couldn't. It's more like I don't necessarily want to think that way, because to me Titivillus is a full-on character whose purpose really flows from his own needs and actions. So to me, it's more about, and I don't want to spoil here, but to me, it's about, is Titivillus somebody who at this point wants to be friends with Devlin, or is it somebody who's manipulating him because they know that Devlin wants to be friends with him? Or is it some sort of a strange combination of both, right? And just by sort of playing to that, and watching them, have fun, but also keeping that undercurrent of uncertainty, I think you can get to some really, really interesting places that comment on that, but they comment on that kind of almost through, an accidental observation rather than something that's where the character would be sort of used as a crutch for the other character. Because I think that if I would try that approach, I worry I would end up with a story where one of the characters would sort of really be a crush for the other character rather than being a fully developed one. And I think that in order to emotionally really feel for both of them in the story, you kind of need to take them at the same level.
One of the things I do want to talk about, I mean, we're kind of coming to the end of our time to chat, is
we're good. We easily can take 10 more minutes.
Okay, cool. That's great. Well, because this is a subject which I think really does need some exploration, because Devlin is, as you've already said, a queer character, and a kind of in a way, an arch queer character in that he's very camp. He's drawing on influences such as you said, Oscar Wilde, Terry Thomas, the British tradition of camp gay, and I wanted to get your views on him as a queer character, and a long-standing queer character, because it was the early 1990s that we're talking about for Swimming in Blood. What's your take on Devlin's sexuality, the way it defines him, the way it motivates him, the way that you as a writer necessarily use it to tell the story?
Well, I mean, it's super important for me because having unapologetically gay character like that, one with the history, but two also just the fact that he is very unapologetic about it and just genuinely enjoys being gay and doesn't let anybody get in the way of that. That to me is incredibly empowering and I think really awesome. I think that as somebody who is queer and deals with arts and sees an incredible amount of stories that I sort of have to process because that's my life. Very often we still kind of tend to fall into these traps as humans of trying to tell stories about people of any sort of minority almost. As primarily, some sort of a socially focused story or something that has a message or something that is very much about something instead of just being about a person who is also this or that, right? And for me, that's one of the beautiful parts about about the whole Devlin thing is he doesn't care. It's literally him. This is how he is, and that's both in regards to his queerness and in regards to his sexuality. And to speak freely and to act freely in those regards is something that I think can just help other people feel seen. It can also help people see other people as people, and it can also just help people have fun.
It's fascinating that you say that because it's so refreshing, and it's been refreshing for such a long time to see a character who is open, not just openly gay, but confidently, extravagantly gay, and so often, particularly if a writer, as you say, is trying to prove a point, someone's sexuality, someone's race, someone's gender can become inadvertently reframed as a problem. Whereas with Devlin, it's not a problem; it's just a fact. He's not necessarily dealing with being queer because that's just his reality, and it's something that I've really noticed in a very large splash that you've gone full throttle for that, like unashamed, unabashed. This isn't a problem. This is reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's something where I feel like that's really it was the only way to really go with it. I mean, I think that we really started with that right from the opening page of my Devlin run, where Devlin leaves a party where he's basically fucking the entire soccer team of Real Madrid. Though I don't think that we actually said that was specifically that team, and it doesn't have to be, of course. I'll just leave that to the reader's imaginations. And just leaves and accidentally just forgets that his I think it was Balenciaga coat has a dildo inside it, and that dildo then becomes a huge part of the entire story because it's the dildo that Titivillus is eventually trapped in. So there are ways to play off of it in the story that are that can be there's really a myriad of ways like that, but yeah, I believe that it shouldn't be anything more than what it is, and I think that how to say it? No, go on. Please ask another question. I had something more to say, but then it sort of half vanished.
Okay. I mean, I guess my next question was going to be, as a writer, how do you get it right? If you see what I mean. How do you kind of walk the line between, camp, particularly with a very camp character, with making him humorous, making him a disruptor, having a lot of fun with it, but also making sure he doesn't become a pastiche of himself?
I just think about how I act at parties.
Well, apparently you do have experience doing odd things at orgies, so I understand.
Oh my God. I mean, I'm sure that there are some tweets probably somewhere. Who knows? No comment. No, I mean, I've led a busy and varied life, so I think that my life probably doesn't form my understanding of Devlin to a certain fairly decent extent. Yeah.
So
That's probably fair to say.
what kind of plans do you have for Devlin? Because this run seems to be going down very well. You've got a great relationship between Titivillus and Devlin. Without spoilers, do you have things mapped out, or are you going to take it kind of a step at a time if more stories come through?
Well, there's a few shorter stories that I've some already written, some I'm just working on that are going to come after this bigger story's done. Because I kind of just wanted to flex the short story muscles and kind of tell these shorter stories that amount to a larger whole over time. And then from that point on, there's another big story that I want to tell that sort of almost becomes the third part of this larger story that I've been telling since the beginning. I have to talk with Matt Smith, the editor, about the specifics. But that would probably be the largest story I've told with Devlin so far, and I am really, really excited about it. And it would be, I really can't say anything about it without kind of spoiling stuff, so I'm going to try not to. But suffice to say, I would love to say it. I really, really love writing Devlin, and I would love to write Devlin for a good while. Yeah.
It's fantastic that we've been able to make this happen because, as you said, it felt right. It felt like the right fit at the time. When you were talking about Devlin on Twitter, wow, it feels like a very long time ago. It felt like it was the right direction to go.
It's still and it truly still feels like it. And there's there's sometimes a story just tells you, hey, or a character just tells you, hey, we should have fun together. And then you try and you realize that that's absolutely where you're supposed to be. And that's very much how I feel about Devlin. That's very much how I feel about 2000 AD. So who knows what happens next?
Let's just talk a moment about Mike Dowling, because I think one of the big charms of this series and of Call Me By Thy Name, which was the story that you did in Meg 400, has been Mike's artwork. For me, he's alongside Sean Phillips, he's one of the definitive Devlin artists. I mean, what's your feeling on his work?
Oh, I completely love Mike's artwork. I really hope we'll end up working together on Devlin for a very long time. I think that he gets the story, he gets the character, and he has a very similar sense of humor. So it seems like he's having a really good time, and like that's coming through in the artwork as well.
Oh, fantastic chat with Aleš Kot, talking about Devlin Waugh, A Very Large Splash, which is running in the Judge Dredd magazine at the moment. 417 is the issue on sale right now from all good newsagents and comic book stores. Make sure you pick up the Meg. Don't forget that if you subscribe to 2000 AD and the magazine, you get great subscription incentives, different tiers. Go onto our website 2000ad.com and find out about the great gifts that you can get. Even if you subscribe digitally, then you get a 50% off voucher for the 2000 AD webshop, which is pretty Zarjaz. Next time on the 2000 AD Thrillcast, we're going to be delving into what's coming up. No spoilers right now, but we've got some really nice guests lined up for the rest of this year. So make sure you keep it 2000 AD. Make sure you stay tuned, and I shall see you next time. Splendid Birthrig, Earthlets.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.